Everyone, so this is the pre-recorded lesson that will span Tuesday and Wednesday. So I'll still ask you to be signing in, as you know, into the live lesson at the very beginning, because I'm going to use that time then to have individual discussions with you, because it is stop and review week. So I'll try and get through everybody across the two lessons, and we'll obviously discuss your progress and so on. But obviously I still want you guys to have something to be working on when you're not in a discussion with me. And we're going to get started with our schizophrenia topic. And obviously you're going to need teacher input, but just as a way into it, I've sort of set you up with a little bit of introductory reading. There's a couple of video clips that I'd like you to kind of do and take some brief notes on, so that next week, after stop and review week, we can get started with it fully. Now, it is a really short topic. There's not a massive amount that needs to be covered in terms of schizophrenia, and so much of it overlaps with psychopathology. So I know there's still a lot of uncertainty about the exams, but I kind of thought, well, do you know what? I think the students have a right to have the full course delivered and to have explored everything that A-level psychology has. And this is our last topic that needs to be covered. But also in doing this, we're going to be revisiting and revising the psychopathology topic anyway, because of course schizophrenia is an example of a psychopathology. So I think it's important that we do. So that's just your outline of the week. And by way of retrieval, I want us to go back and revisit our psychopathology. So pause the video and 5 quick questions to respond to. And then when you're ready, unpause and I'll go through the answers. So don't be tempted to play on, because this is going to be useful to secure this stuff in your long-term memory. So let's review those answers. So all of these questions that I've put in here, we're going to need as we move on and start applying to the topic of schizophrenia. That's why they're there. So any gaps in your knowledge, it is really important that you pause and you go and address it. You create some flashcards, you retest yourself, because we don't want to be going into it with any misconceptions. So the two sort of manuals, if you like, that are used as diagnostic tools by psychiatrists across the world are the DSM-V, so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition, and that's the one we've spoken most about, and the ICD-10, which is the International Classification of Disorders, 10th edition. They both do exactly the same thing in that they're used by psychiatrists as a diagnostic reference manual. But we find differences, and this is the interesting bit, because they're both supposed to be able to be used across nations, internationally, but yet we find that where the DSM might diagnose something as a disorder, the ICD might not, based on how long you've suffered the symptoms for example. So that's one of the things that we're going to have to explore in terms of schizophrenia. There's problems with classifying and diagnosing. There's some inconsistencies. Number 2 then, of course, when we're talking about definitions for abnormality, we've got our big 4. And I asked you which one would refer to an accurate perception of reality. And it is, of course, Jehoda's criteria, so the deviation from ideal mental health. And that's going to be relevant to schizophrenia, because one of the sort of standout symptoms, if you like, in particular types of schizophrenia is these delusions and this lack of knowing what's real and what's an illusion and what's a hallucination. So people with schizophrenia are lacking in that accurate perception of reality. I asked you what the biological approach would say about trying to explain a disorder such as schizophrenia, or the one we've looked up until now, OCD. We talk about the assumptions of the approach, don't we? So they might say, well, it must be genetic. You must have inherited it. It's to do with your genotype, your DNA. And I put that word predisposition there. The idea that, yes, there's environmental triggers too that leads to the phenotype, but you have a genetic vulnerability, a predisposition that makes you more likely to develop it. They would talk about biochemistry, so our neurotransmitters, and say there must be some sort of imbalance there, too high levels, too low. And they would talk about neuroanatomy, actual structural differences in the brain. Now we're going to be applying all of those when we're looking at biological explanations for schizophrenia. Is there a gene? Is it to do with dopamine? We'll be looking at the dopamine hypothesis. Are there particular regions in the brains of schizophrenics that are different to non-schizophrenics? I asked you about speech production, the region of the brain, and that is of course Broca's area. And I've asked you that because in schizophrenia, one of the symptoms that we find in some schizophrenics is a loss of speech or very confused speech. They almost lose that ability to produce coherent speech. And the fifth one was dopamine, and that's a very important neurotransmitter in our explanation of schizophrenia. So you can see already, I hope, how much overlap there is between what we've done so far and how we're going to be using that and applying it to this particular disorder. So in that sense, I think you'll find this quite useful, but also quite easy. There's some sciencey bits, of course, where we've got to look at specific regions of the brain and specific explanations. But a lot of what we're going to be doing, you'll be thinking, oh yeah, got that, know that, oh, I remember when, which is great. It's a great way to end the course. So this is just to flag up that you've already got your knowledge organisers in your knowledge organiser booklet, and you've got a number of pages on schizophrenia. And the first bit that we're going to look at, which of course makes sense to start with, is how we diagnose and classify. So basically we're going to be exploring, well, what is schizophrenia? What do those manuals, if you like, the DSM and the ICD, what do they say the symptoms are? What different types of schizophrenia are there? And, you know, how reliable are these diagnostic tools, and how easy is it to classify somebody as having a particular type of schizophrenia? So we're going to be exploring all of that to get started. So just to remind you, you've got your knowledge organiser already and you can start using it. And then this is the checklist. Now, I've got these printed but sat in school, that's no use, so I'm going to share them electronically on Teams, but they're your revision packs. So remember, for each topic you've got a revision pack, and it has the checklist, and it has a series of retrieval questions, and it has past exam questions. And it would be at this point normally that I would be releasing that to you, giving that to you. Unfortunately, I can't give you the paper copy, but I'll give it to you electronically. And that checklist just gives you an overview of what this topic is going to involve. So we will begin with the classification, you know, what are the subcategories, how do we diagnose it, what are the symptoms? We're going to be distinguishing between positive and negative symptoms. Then we'll go on to explain it. So what would the biological approach say as to why people suffer schizophrenia? Let's look at some psychological ones. We'll focus on cognitive, and then we'll focus on one that I suppose it would be most closely aligned to psychodynamic, but we don't call it that. We call it family dysfunctional theory. So that's a bit different. I think you'll find that interesting. So we look at explaining it, and then we look at treating it. So that structure should look very familiar to you. When we did the psychopathology topic, we talked about how we define abnormality, how we explain it, and how we treat it. And of course, in that topic, we focused on OCD, depression, and phobias. Here, we've got an easier job. We're just doing it for schizophrenia. How we define and classify, how we explain from different approaches, and therefore how we treat from different approaches. And of course, we're going to be doing all of our usual evaluation. So that's the topic in a sort of checklist form overview. And we're going to be going with this properly. So make sure you've got a new section in your folder or a new folder completely. I know we're not in school. I know I'm not able to do file checks in the same way. But it's really important for you and for your revision that you keep organised. So get yourself a new folder, a section set up. Even if you haven't got file dividers and you're not able to get any at the moment, just a piece of paper that makes it clear, right, this is where schizophrenia starts. Okay, a little bit of key terminology, but this is all found in the textbook, and I'm going to give you the page reference for that in a minute. It's in the year 2 book, and I believe it's page 202, but that's on the next slide anyway. But we're going to be reading and thinking about, of course, the symptoms of schizophrenia. And we're going to make a distinction between positive and negative symptoms. Now, Normally, you would think positive's good, negative's bad. That's not how it works when we talk about symptoms, because really no symptom of a psychopathology, of a disorder, is a good thing. So when we talk about a positive symptom, what we mean is something that you are experiencing in addition to normal. So something that normal people wouldn't experience, but that you, because of that disorder, are experiencing. So for example, hallucinations. If you are normal, you don't experience hallucinations. If you're schizophrenic, you might, not always, but you might. So therefore, that's a positive symptom. A negative symptom, on the other hand, is something that normally you would have, but if you are suffering from some aspects of schizophrenia, you are lacking in it. So it's a loss of something. So a loss of speech, that's a negative symptom. Normally you'd have it, it's the consequence of your disorder, you haven't got it, negative symptom. An inability to sleep, a lack of appetite. If it's a lack of something or an inability of something that normally you would be able to do, we call it a negative symptom. And schizophrenia is made up of both positive and negative symptoms. And you have to understand that distinction. And there's some examples there. So speech poverty, not being able to speak, having a reduced frequency and quality of speech, would be a negative symptom. Avolition is a fancy way of saying you basically lose your motivation. That it's a loss of, so it's a negative symptom. Whereas something like delusions and hallucinations, we would say is a positive symptom. So remember, that's not saying it's a good thing. It's definitely not a good thing to have a hallucination, but it's in addition to the norm. That's the way I would always remember it. So you might want to pause this video at that point and say that back to yourself a couple of times, or write something down to help concrete that in your mind, because that's a really important distinction. You might want to draw it as a little visual on a flashcard, but you've got to understand that distinction before we can kind of go any further. Okay, so let's get you set up for a bit of this independent sort of introductory work, if you like. In your Year 2 textbook, and you've got the password for that, it's page 202 and 203 that gets us starting to think about what schizophrenia is, the definitions, the diagnosis, and the different symptoms, both positive and negative, that we've just mentioned there. It also gets us starting to think about how reliable and how much we can trust these diagnosis tools. Okay, but I have got some additional notes on that for you as well. So your job, again, pause this, take some time. I know it means you're unable to have it printed out when it's the electronic textbook, but take yourself some notes, create yourself a little glossary of those key terms, make some flashcards from it, start to get yourself familiar with this new language of our schizophrenia topic. Now, you'll have seen from that reading, there is this idea that there is a little bit of variation between not just the symptoms that one schizophrenic might experience compared to another, but also what those manuals, what those diagnostic tools say. And this is one of the big differences. The ICD-10 identifies 5 categories or subtypes of schizophrenia. And they do this because there's such a variation in symptoms. So a paranoid schizophrenic will present very, very differently from, say, a residual schizophrenic or a disorganized schizophrenic. So they felt it was appropriate to have subtypes. And the DSM used to, but has recently got rid of that and no longer talks about different subcategories. So here we have the 2 diagnostic manuals that are supposed to be able to be used globally and are supposed to be able to be used with consistency to lead to the same diagnosis. And one uses subcategories and subtypes of the disorder because it feels it needs to, because the symptoms are so vast and varying, and another one doesn't. So that's just one of the differences that we find. I personally find the subtypes categories quite useful. I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't speak from their perspective, but I find it does help us to understand just how different the symptoms can be. Because often we find that when you say the word schizophrenia to somebody, they think about a paranoid schizophrenic. They think about the person who has the delusions, often a real paranoia. They feel like they're being persecuted in some way or people are plotting against them. They have the hallucinations, the hearing voices. And often that is the group that people think of. It's sort of synonymous with the word schizophrenia. And that's about 35 to 40% of schizophrenics have that type. And I think these subcategories help us to recognise that is just one type. And actually, many schizophrenics will not present with hallucinations and delusions or paranoia. And, you know, we might see somebody who would still be diagnosed as schizophrenic being much more, having mood swings, being much more sort of low and having a really flattened mood, being quite confused all over the place at times, showing some disorganisation in their speech, in their personal hygiene. And we wouldn't necessarily, unless we were experts, we wouldn't necessarily think that was schizophrenic. We might think, oh, that's somebody who's suffering from depression, or we might just think it was personality traits. Whereas this would tell us it's disorganised schizophrenia. So I think it's important you're aware that there is the difference between the DSM and the ICD on this one, but also that you're aware of those different subcategories. And the one I also think is really important, because when it comes to this question of whether it's moral to place labels on people, especially a label such as schizophrenic, nobody wants that label. I think this residual schizophrenia shows us just how long-lasting those labels and titles are. About 20% of people diagnosed have this type, and they experience very mild symptoms, and even when, whether it be through treatment or time, those symptoms seem to disappear, you've still got the label. You are still a residual schizophrenic. And I think that's quite useful to think about in the mix of Dr. Satz's argument about how we shouldn't place these labels onto people. And we're going to come back and rethink about him in a bit. So on Teams, you should have seen I shared, it's a PDF document called The Signs of Schizophrenia, and it's just a short activity to apply that. So when you feel like you've got your head around those different subtypes of schizophrenia, then you would go through each of these sort of scenarios, if you like, and identify whether or not you believe they have schizophrenia in the first place, picking out where are the positive and where are the negative symptoms, and then if you feel it's appropriate, you would also come to a conclusion about what category or subtype of schizophrenia they might have. So there's sort of three jobs to do really. Have they got schizophrenia? Or you might suggest a different explanation. Where are the positive and negative symptoms, and what subtype would you place them in? And that will just help to apply and concrete all of that learning so far. Having done that, you must be getting towards the end of the hour by now, or 50 minutes I should say, by the time you've read and made notes from your textbook, got your head around the positive and negative symptoms and applied your knowledge. A couple of case study videos, and this might take you into Wednesday's lesson as well. This is all sort of ongoing. As long as we get this done by the end of the week, we'll be in a good position for next week. So both of these are, they're quite old dated videos now actually, but they best demonstrate some of the symptoms. So just a case of watching both of those case studies. I think we have Heather and is it Gareth? I can't remember the first person's name now. And you just pick out again, what are their symptoms? What subcategory would you put them in? But also, can you see any problems in this idea of diagnosing and classifying, because there are a couple that will become apparent. Okay, so that will just, and it will give you a bit of insight into the sorts of behaviours that present in schizophrenic patients. And then the last thing to reference really, and again this will feed then into Wednesday's lesson, so this is continuous. Tuesday and Wednesday we're building up our picture on schizophrenia. The Masalit. Okay, I believe you've all now successfully logged in at least once. If you haven't, you need to go to that website, but instead of /courses, you need to put sign up, and then you need to sign up with your school email and set yourself a password, obviously. But then once you're in, go to courses, go to schizophrenia, and the first video, which I can see there's only just under 11 minutes, watch it. Take some notes, keep pausing it. That will be a really good introduction to the work, and it will consolidate some of what you've done so far, and it will be a great introduction to what we're going to be learning about as we really get going with this course. Okay, so I think that's probably a reasonable amount to cover for Tuesday and Wednesday. Of course, there is no limit. So of course you might think, well, that's not going to take me the full time. Rather than put your feet up or have a lie down on that bed that might look very tempting if you're sat in your bedroom, there's more, there's more on Masalit. You can read ahead in the textbook. You can have a look in the class materials folder on Teams and really get going on looking at some of the materials that are coming up. The topic companion is in there. Yeah, the more reading and kind of getting ahead you can do, the easier you will find it. But obviously I'm going to give you a bit of flexibility here and allow you to manage that time, because you might just need to take a breath and catch up. You might still have some green pen improvements to do on your assessment from Monday. You might feel as though you need to organise your file a bit and spend some time getting sorted and set up. Yeah, that's kind of the purpose of Stop and Review Week, isn't it? That we have those individual conversations, but also you just have a chance to get yourself sorted. And of course, if anybody feels they need help with any of that, then you need to let me know. Okay? Revision is on Tuesday after school, by the way, and we're going to revise psychopathology because it supports this topic so well. So anybody who can make revision about 2:45 on Tuesday, that will be brilliant. Okay, I'll be on Teams. Drop me an email if you're having any problems, questions, etc. All right, thanks, guys.